Hello from Royal Botanical Gardens. We are located in Hamilton and Burlington, Ontario, Canada, where we care for 2,700 acres of cultivated gardens and nature sanctuaries on land that is home of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat peoples. I'm Jen Dick, Interpretation Officer here at RBG. I'd like to welcome you to our world-class rose garden in Hendrie Park. This garden originally opened in 1967 to celebrate Canada's centennial anniversary. The garden featured over 2,000 individual roses. There were few updates to the gardens. In 2008, we added our reflecting pools, but how we grew roses in a monoculture had changed very little over the years. In 2009, the Ontario government introduced the cosmetic pesticide ban, which proved a challenge for maintaining our collection of primarily hybrid tea roses. The Centennial Rose Garden has delighted visitors for decades, but it was time for an update. We needed to bring our collection into the 21st century. After significant renovations, our new rose garden opened in 2018, and it truly is a remarkable garden. To explore the garden's history, the impressive undertaking of rejuvenation from early days of the project to the present, I'm joined by Barb McKean, Head of Education, Jim Mack, Head of Horticulture, and Alex Henderson, Curator of Collections.
After 50 years of trying to grow a conventional rose garden in southern Ontario, RBG decided it was time for a change. We had a vision for a sustainable rose garden where roses wouldn't be the only featured plant. Instead, they would be augmented by herbaceous perennials that gave a more broad color spectrum throughout the growing season, and also brought with them certain beneficial aspects that helped the roses do their thing. Two grand iron gazebos were manufactured by a local foundry and provide the perfect structure for these rambling roses to ramble on. Hopefully in a couple of years they will ramble right on over the top of this gazebo and present a rather unique experience beneath. And speaking of beneath, we also have installed these granite compass features, which feature true north. You can lay your phone down on there and try it, but I'm told that they actually do point true north. Along with our iron features in this garden were these plant stands fashioned for the climbing roses, and they're truly unique in that they have this helicoid look to them by design to speak to the better genetics of our rose hybrids in this garden. All rose beds were excavated to a depth of 18 inches and replaced with compost and mineral soil to spec, citing research pointing to rose replant disorder when installing new rose plants into soils in which roses have been grown for a number of years. Drainage was provided around the perimeter of each rose bed. Concrete paver brick walks and exposed aggregate pathways were designed to provide visitors with gentle meanders to follow, which allowed full access and views of the edge-to-edge beds. Dividing the rose beds into rooms facilitated sponsorship and naming opportunities for the individual beds, as well as for the ipe wood benches placed throughout the garden. Providing a subtle backdrop to the garden is a mirror-imaged collection of fastigiate trees which provide visitors with examples of trees useful in smaller urban gardens.
So when we were in the early stages of designing the rose garden, we had certain considerations to think about. We obviously wanted to create a garden that was beautiful and it was full of great aesthetic appeal. But we also wanted to create a very, very sustainable rose garden. So very early in the design process, we realized that we were going to need roses that were cold hardy, drought tolerant, and most most importantly, black spot tolerant. And the way that we went about doing that was engaging with Peter Kikelski. He was good enough to share his data from New York Botanic Garden on his rose data. We also consulted local rose growers in the local area, and we took data from our collections of roses that had previously grown well on site, and we number crunched that all together. And what we ended up doing was acquiring a load of really great roses, especially roses with superior genetics that had been really introduced since around about the 2000 period, 2001. One of the best opportunities that the redesign of the rose garden afforded us was to include companion plants. And we decided to include companion plants for a number of reasons. Firstly, it extends the season of interest in the rose garden. It also allows us to include a colour palette that's not normally expressed in roses. Critically, it allows us to break up like rose monoculture and the challenges associated with that. But really the critical decision with companion plants was to include plants that have a tried and tested history in attracting beneficial insects. And this was super important in adding to the IPM program and the reduction of chemical sprays in the rose garden. Another great opportunity that the redesign of the garden allowed was for us to take into account landscape and energy conservation. So as you can see here, we laid irrigation pipes at a low volume drip irrigation that applies water directly to the soil. It uses around about 80% less irrigation water, and it's spread out through the garden. With this in mind, the irrigation has just been installed for the first year only because we want the roses to be super hardy and drought tolerant, so we don't want to spoil the roses. But it can also be used in case we get a drought as well as a backup, which is great. You'll also see that we've applied a really good layer of mulch, and this essentially is like a forest floor. So instead of having to use harmful chemicals and fertilizers to feed the plants, what we're doing instead is using the mulch, which as it degrades will put nutrients into the soil and keep the roses healthy and happy. One of the most interesting opportunities with the rose garden is that every year from June to October we evaluate the roses. We evaluate them for black spot resistance, we evaluate them for bloom abundance and landscape value, and we also evaluate them for fragrance, because who doesn't love fragrant roses? And what we're going to do is, like when we number crunch the data, what we'll find is that any rose that scores below a 6 out of 10, that rose will be re-evaluated and possibly be replaced, and replaced with a more black spot resistant rose. So as the garden evolves, so will the resiliency of the garden by the rose choices that we make in future, guided by the rose evaluations.
Well, from their rich folklore and history to their fragrant beauty, roses are loved by people all over the world. And since the 14th century, people have been cultivating them, developing them, changing them, and they've changed in many directions, and they're changing still, but changing now in the direction of sustainability. That's basically the theme that we chose for approaching interpretation in this garden.
We were at the table on this project right from the very beginning, and along with our horticulture team and the rose consultant, we were able to talk about stories and what we wanted to share with the public about roses and how we wanted to do that, what the best way was to arrange the garden, to share not only their beauty, but a bit about their amazing story. People from around the world relate to them on so many different levels, and we really wanted to meet them where they are in that kind of relationship, whether it's inspiration for art or poetry, or whether they're really interested in how many awards a particular rose has won in the last decade. We knew that in order to tell the story of 21st century roses, we really needed actually to start in the past. And so we decided to wrap the garden in a historical walk back through time. So guests walk along a pathway, they encounter displays about the different horticultural classes. On one side of the garden, the ancestors; on the other side of the garden, the modern roses. And each horticultural class has a planting of roses representing that class around an interpretive panel. And the interpretive panels try and connect with people in different ways. So it maybe the art, we include El Redoute painting on each one. We include quotes and sayings from a variety of cultures, from Chinese proverbs to Shakespeare to well-known philosopher Ziggy. And we tried to introduce pop culture in cases. So you may not be aware, but the TV series Game of Thrones, actually, was inspired by the War of the Roses and the rose symbols that represented the families involved. When people leave their journey into the past and enter the main central display area in the rose garden, they leave behind a very linear experience and step into a completely randomized one with a lot going on. And so we decided to actually hold off on interpreting the central area beyond some introductory signage for about a month after the garden opened. And during that time, we watched and we listened. We started with staff. We invited staff to join us out in the garden before opening one morning. And we watched where they tended to gravitate and cluster and what plants and features they were looking at and found most compelling and interesting, and asked them to feed that information back to us. And that gave us sort of a candidate list of things that we might want to feature. And then we watched the public for the next few weeks. And sure enough, staff had done a good job of picking the things that people would find most interesting. And rather than go with large signs in this area, we've gone with smaller specimen signs that use particular plants to tell particular parts of the story of 21st century roses and companion plants.
From mid-June to early October, this garden provides a wonderful space for interpretive programming. We offer short guided tours that visitors can drop in. They can experience the gardens and connect with all of their senses. We also offer discovery stations and discovery carts, and visitors can learn more about the history of roses, the color of roses, the scent of roses, but also the companion plants and the insects that we find in the garden. A highlight this year has been the monarch butterflies. We found quite a number of them throughout the garden. So it's really a wonderful space to program, and it's a beautiful background for events as well. We'd like to leave you with some of our key learnings from this project. Bringing the right mix of industry professionals and consultants, as well as knowledgeable gardens and operations staff, to the project planning table is critical to achieving successful and sustainable overall results. Bringing interpretation into the project at the beginning leads to a much stronger visitor experience in the end. Using the best available data to choose plants with a known history of superior performance related to your location is key to establishing a chemical-free rose garden. Regular performance evaluations allow the removal of plants not making the grade whilst acquiring plants with superior genetics and disease resistance, creating a truly resilient and evolving rose garden free of chemical input. RBG has created a new kind of rose garden, one that is an ever-changing, ever-blooming garden filled not only with roses and herbaceous companion plants, but also with pollinating insects and ideas that can be incorporated into the gardens of many places throughout North America. Thank you for joining us for this overview of our new rejuvenated 21st century rose garden. We hope someday you have the opportunity to come and visit us at Royal Botanical Gardens.